Hello everyone, welcome back to Unraveling Politics, a weekly political analysis show. Today we have some interesting things to talk about. I guess we talk about that every week. But we're going to be talking about the President of the United States, of course. Who else? As you can see in the title, we're going to be talking about whether President Trump is a lame duck president, whether that time has arrived. First, let's define what a lame duck is. If you go to Wikipedia, and I love Wikipedia, by the way, if I was a teacher, I would absolutely allow Wikipedia to be a source that you use, but that's not the point. Wikipedia says, in politics, a lame duck or outgoing politician is an elected official whose successor has already been elected or will be soon. They write a lame duck politician has reduced influence, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And obviously, Trump's successor has not been elected and will not be for almost 3 years. And it does seem like Trump will be president forever, but that is not true. He will be gone in just a few years. In politics, attention is always on the next election. What comes in 2 or 4 years, rarely is it about what's going on right now, which is very sad in my opinion, but that's a story for another time. Since traditional definition does not apply, we're going to be looking at the influence. Does he still have influence? You might be thinking, well, obviously he does. He's the president of the United States. He signs bills into law. He signs executive orders. He still travels around the world, and he does whatever else he's doing. However, as the next few months and years go by, especially once we get past the midterm elections, I suggest that we look how his party is treating him. For example, after 2006, Republicans tried to run away from Bush. They did horribly that year, and they ran away from him. Democrats in 2014 didn't really do that with Obama, and Obama's popularity did rise toward the end, but that was probably to their detriment considering that Hillary Clinton lost in 2016. Then again, Republicans ran away from Bush in 2008 and they still got crushed, but they were probably always going to lose that one. So the point is, usually after the second midterm is when the gears start turning for the next election, which would be in 2028, which is 3 years away. Trump is not eligible to run in 2028, so naturally the attention will turn to his successor. And opinion polling, there's not much of it, but the little bit we do have shows that J.D. Vance will be the natural successor. And I will say this, usually we always say, oh, well, the vice president becomes president. Well, I'll just say like this, and I'm not specifically talking about J.D. Vance here, but usually vice presidents don't end up becoming president. The few examples in recent history have been George H.W. Bush and Joe Biden, but if you think about, except for those, not including politicians who died while they were in office, like where the president dies and the vice president takes over, that is basically it for the 20th century. I'm sure there's somebody else that I'm missing, but it really doesn't happen very often. And most of the time when they do run, they lose, like Hubert Humphrey in 1968. So what should we look out for the years ahead? Well, 3 things. Number 1 is, what is Trump's popularity before the midterm elections and the midterm elections results? If Trump remains underwater, but he's not really that unpopular, his approval maybe it goes up to 43 or 44%, and Democrats only narrowly win control of the House, or if, I don't know how this would happen, but if Republicans retain control of the House, Trump might maintain some policy influence in the near future. Democrats will obviously block as much as they can, assuming they will be in the majority. They're going to be able to block pretty much everything except for Senate confirmations. They might still work with Trump, at least for the foreseeable future. But if the other happens and they lose so badly that the Senate falls as well, then I expect Trump to make a lot of noise, but Republicans are going to quietly move on. And I expect House Republicans and Senate Republicans in this scenario who would be in the minority, then we would have 2 years of utter chaos because nobody would be able to do anything productive. The second thing I would watch for is who and when announces their run for president. And I expect some Republican rebels like Nikki Haley, as she runs, to announce in early 2027. I could imagine J.D. Vance waiting until the summer or maybe the fall to announce a run. Usually the later you wait, the less likely you're going to win. So anyone who doesn't announce by summer of next year will not be in a good position, but you never know. J.D. Vance could afford to wait a little bit later because of his national profile. Also, what we'll be revealing is how active is Trump on the campaign trail during the coming presidential election. Will candidates for House and Senate embrace him, or will they run from him?
Mia Love. I saw Mia Love. She'd call me all the time to help her with a hostage situation. Being held hostage in Venezuela, but Mia Love gave me no love. And she lost. Too bad. Sorry about that, Mia.
If he's not too unpopular and J.D. Vance uses Trump as a campaign puppet, essentially, if Vance promises to be a continuity candidate, then Trump might remain an active president to the very end, like he did in 2021. Trump, when he lost the election in 2020, he remained an active president, and it seemed like for a very long time he had no plan to leave the White House. I don't think he ever acknowledged that he was going to leave until like a few days before. Or no, it was January 6th. That was the day he said he was going to leave. But he didn't say Biden won. He just said there's going to be a transition. So history shows Trump will try to cling on. But I could also see a scenario where if Trump starts doing things that Republicans don't want to put up anymore, they could work with Democrats and override vetoes. We live in a hyper-partisan age, so I don't know if that's going to happen, but it could happen. As of right now, I don't think he is a lame duck president, but the signs are mounting. For example, his approval rating is very low, at least by modern standards. Historically, not so much, but it is low by modern standards. A plurality of voters are saying that Joe Biden did a better job as president than Trump is right now, and that's according to Rasmussen, a GOP pollster. It was 48% to 40%. And I think that's pretty crazy, but I believe those numbers are real. It sounds right to me. Lastly, Trump said that he expects no major reconciliation packages for the rest of his term, which is a pretty big statement. Reconciliation packages are essentially budgetary packages. Of course, there's always going to be a need to fund government departments, but they are talking about things like the One Big Beautiful Bill or the American Rescue Plan, not routine spending or tax packages. Biden, I think, passed 3 or 4 when he was in office, and that was in 2 years, and that was quite a lot, actually. Republicans passing only 1 is quite remarkable, and Democrats had a similar House majority than a couple of years ago to Republicans right now. It was a little bit wider, but they had a smaller Senate majority. If you remember, it was only 50-50, so they can't blame that. And then Trump says in his defense that they don't need any more reconciliation packages because they have everything they already need. And that might be true. However, this announcement is still extraordinary because it basically rules out any future package, and they could theoretically change their mind. But as I said a few weeks ago, Republicans have no plan to pass any major bills, and I believe them, and I think they are quite exhausted, they're quite divided, and they need some time in the wilderness in order to get their act together again, which is our sign that they are lame ducks. One definitive sign that Trump would be a lame duck, if and when we get there, is if Congress begins to override vetoes. For example, Biden never had a veto overridden, even in his dying days of his candidacy and his administration. Trump had 1 veto, and that was in his first term, and that was the National Defense Authorization Act of 2021. Congress passed it in 2020, December 2020, after the presidential election. Biden had already won. The Electoral College, I believe, if they hadn't certified it yet, they were about to. Trump made demands about military bases and social media regulations. Doesn't really matter. Congress completely ignored him and overrode the veto almost unanimously. And I would not be shocked if that starts to happen again. And I don't think we will get there until at the very earliest, the end of 2027, maybe 2028. If Democrats control both chambers, even if they don't have the 2/3 to override it, they could get the ball rolling. And it's possible, depending on the size of their majority, Republicans could go along with it, depending on what it is. Even if no vetoes are overridden, if they get close, that could be a sign that we are heading toward the end. We're still a long way off from that. We'll talk about that again, I guess, in another year. So let's move on. This would be a major bill if it was passed. It wouldn't be a landmark bill, but it would be an important piece of legislation if it did pass. And it probably won't, as I'll get into in a moment. There's been a lot of false information about it. It's about the Save America Act, which the House voted on last week, and it passed a narrow margin of 218 to 213. It was proposed by Representative Chip Roy, a Republican from Texas, and this bill, in short, would require showing proof of citizenship to register to vote in federal elections. And obviously, this is a common sense policy. 83% of Americans, according to Pew Research, believe that ID should be required to vote, including 95% of Republicans and a whopping 71% of Democrats. This is one of those 80-20 issues, and I guess you could say it's an 83-17 issue that Democrats find themselves on the wrong side of. And indeed, most Democrats that I talk to, at least in my life, they're not against voter ID, And frankly, I think the excuses for the 17% come up with, or 17 could include undecided, so really less than 17%. They're quite dehumanizing, in my opinion, and frankly quite racist. So let's expand it a little bit. It requires voter ID to register to vote and to actually vote, which is a little bit different. The polling is just to vote, but if you have an ID to vote, you should be required to show it when you register. So what kind of IDs are we talking about here? It would require you to show proof of citizenship. So you would need to present an eligible ID. It would require states to obtain proof of citizenship in person when registering an individual to vote, and require states to remove non-citizens from the voting rolls. All of those are good things. Your next question, as I got to earlier, is what are valid IDs? Valid IDs are either an unexpired U.S. passport, a real ID, which 160 million Americans have, a military card, together with a military service record showing they were born in the United States, a government-issued ID showing an applicant was born in the U.S., or a valid birth certificate. All stuff pretty much every U.S. citizen should have. Considering you need these things to have a job, to buy alcohol and cigarettes, access adult websites in some areas, fly on a plane, enter a federal building, enter a military base, drive a car, buy a gun, or even to buy a Zyrtec D at Costco. Meanwhile, mail ballots remain a deeply partisan issue, so we're not going to talk about that today. Pew Research did include that in their research, and it turns out that there's still a sharp partisan divide on that. So what is the opposition to this bill? Well, it is from the left, almost exclusively. There was a study from the Brennan Center for Justice, it was in 2006, it was 20 years ago, that says 25% of black people do not have an ID, which, once again, this is 20 years ago. It's often cited. If you ever hear that 25%, that's where it came from. They also have an article back in 2024 which stated 21 million Americans don't have these IDs listed as readily available, which is absolutely insane. If you don't have the things I said earlier, even just one of them, then you probably shouldn't be voting anyway. In terms of things to get, a real ID is probably the easiest. All you need is a birth certificate or a passport, and it's the same ID as your driver's license. It has a star up on the top. You need a birth certificate or passport, a social security number, proof of residency, which could be 2 bank statements, and if you change your name, a lot of the opposition here is because they're like, well, what about married women? Their name doesn't match their birth certificate. Well, all you need is a marriage certificate, a divorce decree, or a court order. That's basically it. So Real ID enforcement, by the way, began a year ago. It started in May of 2025, and it was supposed to begin in 2008. So everyone's had 17 years to get a Real ID on their driver's license. And if you don't have a driver's license, no worry, you can get a normal state ID with one. Very easy. So what about the politics of it? Well, some have pointed out with the midterm elections, it makes it look like Republicans are trying to steal the election. And I will admit the optics here are not very good. The truth is they've done this for years. The first Trump administration tried to do this in 2018. Republicans tried it in 2023 when Joe Biden was in office, and they're trying to do it again now. It would have to pass a Senate filibuster, which would require 7 Democrats to join with Republicans to pass it. Chances remain really, really low. Normally, going against the public would be a bad move by Democrats or by any political party, but I don't think this is going to affect them politically. If a Democrat was president and a Republican Congress passed it and then that president vetoed it, then that would probably be a bad look, but we're not in that scenario. Then again, there will absolutely be legal challenges if this somehow is signed into law, and I imagine it will be the ACLU, among others. It's not because it's a bad policy or that because the policy would be discriminatory, but it's because states are usually in charge of election law. And I imagine, though, because this is registration for federal elections and not state elections, court would rule that the administration was correct with the signing of this law. With the exceptions of the 19th, 15th, 24th, and 26th Amendment, the federal government has no other constitutional establishments for voting. There's the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which has been watered down over the years. There is the National Registration Act of 1993, the Help America Vote Act of 2002, but those don't really expand or restrict the right to vote. They just redefine the laws and the standards. And besides that, states run basically everything else. They decide if there is mail-in voting, early voting, if ID is required, how many days of early voting there is, what days of the week early voting is, if felons can vote, how long you have to live in a state before you can vote. There's quite a lot they can decide. However, if there is a struggle between the states and federal government, unless it is a constitutional argument, the feds always win. That is the supremacy clause in action. Next, we have the government shutdown. This is now the third U.S. government shutdown in Trump's 14 months in office, and we had 0 under Joe Biden. So this would be the third government shutdown really in a very long time. Before we continue, let me remind you of what the president said in 2013 about government shutdowns on Twitter. He said, leadership, whatever happens, you're responsible. If it doesn't happen, you're responsible. He wrote in August 2013, fact, the real reason why Americans have to worry about a government shutdown is because Obama refuses to pass a budget. All right, so whether you agree with it or not, I tend to disagree with this thinking. I think it's too simplistic and overgeneralizes, but we do need to hold people to the standard that they set for others. So what is going on? Well, unlike the last 2 shutdowns, this only impacts the Department of Homeland Security. The Senate failed to pass a bill to fund it. It failed 52 to 47. 60 votes were required. John Fetterman of Pennsylvania joined the Republicans to keep the government open. Love that guy. They tried a 2-week stopgap bill, which failed. It was supposed to kick the can down the road. And as a result, the TSA and FEMA will no longer receive federal funding. And as I said, Customs and Border Protection continues to operate because they have tens of billions of dollars in reserve already. So the shutdown, I think, will be ultimately pointless, even if Democrats do get some of their demands, which I've detailed before, and I'm not going to get into again here. So when will the shutdown end? It's going to be a few days, if not longer. The House is out of session until next week, February 23rd. The Senate won't return until the same day, and that will give us at least 9 days, maybe 10, which would be a fairly long shutdown. It would be one of the longest, not the longest, but I'll have to update you again next week if anything changes. Which I don't think it will. There was also the Munich Security Conference. This tends to happen once a year, and I'm sure you remember newly inaugurated Vice President J.D. Vance telling Europe they didn't have free speech. Well, this time it was Marco Rubio representing the United States, and according to the New York Times, European leaders expressed relief at Rubio's tone, but they are clearly concerned about the state of the world at the moment. And I only bring this up because I think this could show what a Rubio presidency could look like in the years ahead. And he said things like Europe and America belong together, that we want Europe strong, and he said that the 2 world wars of the last century was a reminder that our destiny is and will always be intertwined with yours. One European politician, who don't remember the name, it was in the European legislature, said that the speech didn't make anything worse, but it didn't make it better either. However, Rubio did echo some of the far right's talking points about mass migration and civilization erasure, which I think has some fair points. European leaders have denied immigration as an issue, and populist parties had abused the fact that there's that hole where voters want immigration reform and politicians won't deliver it, so that has allowed them to rise. And I think the question is, does Rubio believe what he's saying, or is he repeating what Trump would say if he was there? Not so sure. If it's the first one, then it would be a remarkable transformation from his early career before Trump came onto the scene 10 years ago. Truly, it sounds like the administration has the worst of all worlds. They could work closely with Europe as previous administrations have done, or they could work against it, and instead it seems they're doing this wishy-washy thing where they do neither. There were some meetings about Ukraine, of course. Nothing has really changed there. Mark Rutte, the former Netherlands Prime Minister and current Secretary General of NATO, poured cold water on the idea that Europe is going to go it alone. There's a strategic reason for this. If America and Europe broke apart right now, then Russia would know it has a window of at least a few years without American military support where they can invade a weakened Europe. And that's the fear that Europeans have at the moment, and I think it's overblown, of course. Russia can't even defeat Ukraine, which is a country was supposed to be an easy country to beat. Much less they're not going to beat a country like Poland or Germany. As for the Ukraine war, it seems like nothing has changed either on the front lines in Ukraine or in Munich. Lastly, let's end on some good news. There was some jobs and inflation news, which I'll be the first to admit it surprised me. Tariffs seem to have had only a mild effect on inflation thus far. We've recorded a rate of 2.4%, which is the lowest since April of last year. The biggest drivers of prices were gasoline, that went down due to OPEC increasing production, and oil prices have been significantly lower, as well as gas as a result. The largest increases were in energy services, not commodities, services, which I'm sure many of you are aware of with increasing electricity bills. Medical care and shelter also increased by a decent amount over last year. And I've said this for a while, but a lot of these are chronic issues. We don't have enough medical care professionals in this country. We don't have enough homes for rent or to buy. And I'm starting to wonder if our 2% inflation days are over. 3% might be the new normal. And 3% is roughly the long-term average. And indeed, inflation has not been at or below target, which is 2%, in almost 5 years, which is having a cumulative effect. And our inflationary deficits have absolutely caused issues, and taming inflation would be helpful by reducing the deficit. And without getting too technical, the Fed has a dual mandate, which is to keep inflation low and with employment as high as it can be. The problem with these is these can be mutually exclusive things. And I'm wondering if it would be a good idea if we scrap the maximum employment mandate. I don't think this will happen because it would most likely mean the Federal Reserve would keep rates higher for longer to tame inflation without regard to employment, but I think it's something we should consider. Most countries don't have a dual mandate, so this would not be without precedent. However, it would definitely not be without controversy. So that is all for now. If you like this podcast, please leave a like and subscribe, share with your family and friends and your late neighbors, why not? And as always, please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.